Of medications, devices, and diagnostic products intended for human use. This session will address the most current information and tools and best practices in the field.
And to know more about the topic, I would like to introduce our moderator of this session, Dr. Sundeep Salvi, sir, Distinguished Research Professor, Symbiosis International University, and Director of Pulmocare Research and Education, Foundation, Pune. Sir has done his MBBS in BJ Medical College, and he also holds his PhD in Clinical Medicines from University of Southampton. Sir also serves as the Director of Chest Research Foundation in Pune and is actively involved in research in the field of COPD and asthma. Sir is currently exploring the non-smoking phenotype of COPD in India. Not only this, Sir has more than hundreds of published papers in peer-reviewed international journals. And now I would like to call upon Dr. Sundeep Salvi, sir, onto the dais to introduce our speakers of the session.
Wow, what a wonderful audience. Wish you all a very good morning. On behalf of SYMHEALTH, it is indeed a real pleasure to welcome you to track 3 on clinical research, trials and tribulations. I am very privileged to have 2 very eminent faculty speakers to open the topic for discussion, and then we will have a panel discussion with the 2 faculties. We will start with Dr. Sanjay Pujari. I'll introduce you to him in a minute, and then we will have Dr. Harshika Sachdev, who will follow him. The plan is Dr. Pujari will speak for 15 minutes, followed by Dr. Harshika for another 15 minutes, and then the remaining 15 minutes we will keep for discussion. Any questions that anybody would like to ask from the audience, we will address those issues. The whole objective of organizing this special track was to highlight the fact that clinical research in India is growing and it will continue to grow for a long period of time. It is a necessity to improve healthcare services for our nation. They say the only constant in medicine is change. The treatment that you receive today will be very likely outdated tomorrow. You will have better drugs, safer drugs, and more effective drugs. So, in order to achieve this, we have to keep on innovating and coming up with newer and newer ideas, the newer understandings of the disease that give rise to newer development of drugs. And once the drugs are developed, it is critical and crucial to test them out in clinical practice through clinical trials. India has probably one of the largest number of pharmaceutical companies in the world. And although they produce a large number of drugs, what is happening over the last few years is innovation has started, where new drugs are being developed and being tested out in clinical trials and then given to the patients in clinical care. So all that requires a huge team effort. We need doctors to take part in clinical trials, and we need the other team members to do the operations part of the clinical trials. And it's this team that is necessary and responsible for the development of new drugs. Dr. Sanjay Pujari is a good friend of mine, a fellow colleague from the BJ Medical College. He is perhaps one of the pioneers in the field of HIV medicine, both research as well as clinical services. After doing his MD in medicine, he took an untreaded path, had the courage to do that, and said, I'm going to make my career in HIV research. And this is way back in 1990s, when HIV was just at its infancy and at its slowly rising to its peak. And Dr. Pujari took up the challenge to do something in that field. Apart from being an excellent clinician offering quality services to his patients, he also made himself into an excellent researcher, conducting clinical trials not only national but multinational, international clinical trials and advanced the science of HIV/AIDS to a completely different level. So, a perfect example of a good clinician and a good researcher, and therefore we are very, very fortunate to have him here to talk to us and share his experiences and knowledge of how clinicians can contribute to research, why should clinicians contribute to research, and how should they go about doing that. That's going to be the crux of his presentation, and then followed by Harshika Sachdev, who has probably worn more hats than what any one of us sitting in this hall have. She started with her career in pharmacy and then did everything in all fields, like drug development with a pharmaceutical company, product development. Then she worked with CROs, she worked with data management, data analysis, you name that, which is associated with clinical development and clinical trials. And she earlier worked with a large number of companies, including Pfizer and Covance and Accenture, and currently works with JARC Healthcare. So we are also very, very fortunate to have her. She's going to talk about the other side of the physicians, the other team members other than the physicians, who are absolutely vital and crucial in enhancing clinical trials in our country. And she's going to show us the career path and how you can build a wonderful career in that field. So without wasting much time, may I invite Dr. Sanjay Pujari to speak to our audience and share his expertise and experience for inspiring physicians and clinicians to take part in research in addition to the clinical services that they offer.
Sorry, Sandy, I was not ready with any, so I just made some notes here. Okay, first of all, thank you for inviting me, and I'm basically a clinician and I like to talk on clinical aspects of disease management, etc. But since I've been involved in research, I try to motivate people to get into this exciting component of my work. So I don't know where to start really and why clinicians should be interested in research. Not everybody can do research. That's something which is very clear. You need to have a little passion to try to look at problems in your practice, try to understand a question, and which you have an eager to address that question. I'm not just talking about clinical trials, because clinical trials is one component of clinical research. Clinical research starts with basic science research in the bench, in the lab. Then it translates into trying to understand the clinical significance of those bench results, and then trying to develop interventions to try and harness that for developing or cures or treatments, etc. So it's a step-by-step process, and clinical trials is the end spectrum where you test an intervention, whether it is a drug or a device or whatever, to see whether you can translate those inventions or discoveries into clinical practice. The most important reason why physicians or clinical practitioners should understand some elements of research is because it improves the quality of your clinical practice. So if you understand research, if you understand research methodology, some epidemiological issues, some biostatistical issues, you will be able to read a paper well. And once you read the paper, you may be able to then translate those evidences into practice at the bedside. And this is what is very important, that unfortunately in medical education, when I and Sundeep passed our medical colleges, we didn't have a focus on interpreting evidence. And this is such an important aspect of clinical practice, that without that, most of the practice then really is wisdom based, as I call, or experience based. And an experience can be wrong, and repeating an experience over a period of time doesn't harness that experience as something which is useful for you. So I think interpreting evidence is critical element in clinical practice. And that really helped me also to improve the quality of clinical practice that I provide to my patients. The other aspect, because we are living in this COVID era, I thought I should briefly talk about how science struggled in the COVID era to deliver evidence. And this was the pandemic once in a lifetime in all our in our careers. There you see intersection between how evidence is generated and how rapidly you need to translate these evidences into practice, leading to so many wrong things that we did in the COVID-19 pandemic because of the urgency of the pandemic. So the struggle that science had in trying to answer some of those questions, develop some interventions, led to kind of semi-chaos in the COVID pandemic. So initially we saw repurposed drugs, hydroxychloroquine, ivermectin, etc., which was rampantly used. Steroids were rampantly used. But then evidence came in, and then the pathophysiology was established of the disease, and that is how you develop interventions subsequently. They were tested in clinical trials. But at the same time, I think science during the COVID-19 epidemic, particularly from the vaccine front, was historic. The rapidity with which clinical trials were conducted to demonstrate vaccine efficacy. Vaccine efficacy is population-based studies. You need large sample sizes to demonstrate decline in the incidence of COVID-19. So that is the triumph of science during this period of COVID-19, where clinical trials really demonstrated rapidity, that you may be able to get away through those regulatory aspects, through those ethical aspects when you confront with an emergency like this. At the same time, science also struggled during the COVID-19 epidemic in trying to, big journals, Lancet and New England Journal of Medicine, struggled with the number of papers which came in, leading to some compromise in the peer review process. And this led to withdrawal of papers in the Lancet, for example, which demonstrated hydroxychloroquine was actually more toxic if used in the COVID-19 situation. So publications were quite historic. You will not understand the significance of this because it never happened in the history of journal literature, that you publish and then you withdraw the paper, entire paper, saying that the methodology was wrong. So that is also something which is important. So I think there are multiple aspects to this, but looking at, and I can stop anytime, Sandeep, because I came actually for question and answer. So it's fine. So first thing is, when I started research, when I was a medical student actually in BJ Medical College, and we had this problem of not having CD4 counts available for our HIV patients. And that was something which was important to monitor the immunological status. But I read somewhere that the total lymphocyte count, which you can derive from the hemogram, may be able to predict the CD4 count. Now we can't really know how the correlation is. So we carried out a small study where we actually entered I personally entered it into the Excel file, the CD4 count and then gave it to a statistician, and then they saw a correlation with that, and then they had a sensitivity specificity of a cutoff of a TLC less than 1200, which predicts a CD4 less than 200. So that is where need-based research starts. So here is the situation, like in my situation, it was where I wanted to develop a low-cost intervention, a low-cost investigation to find out whether that will be useful for monitoring patients when CD4 was not widely available. Once it started, and once you see that, that paper got accepted as a poster in an international AIDS conference, then you tend to get networks, then you tend to get an exposure. So crucial thing is exposure. It's very important to network with people, particularly people who carry out research. Once you are known in the field, you are part of networks, and automatically people come to you, they will give you research questions, funding comes in, regulatory processes are easily taken care of vis-a-vis an individual as compared to a network. So all of these things really helps once you get an exposure. So exposure is important when you go into conferences, etc. The second exposure I think is very, very important. If you want to do serious research, is to get training in research methodology. And I was fortunate to get a summer school program at the Johns Hopkins. After finishing as a clinician, I did epidemiology and biostatistics. So that is quite counterintuitive rather than doing a super specialization. So 1 month I was at Baltimore and I learned epidemiology and biostatistics. And for me, I think biostatistics gives me a thrill and a kick. So even today, the data that we collect, that biostatistical initial analysis I do in the software, and then give it to a biostatistician to confirm. So that's another kind of thrill which you really get. I think there are two kinds of research you can look at if you're seriously looking at pursuing a career in research along with clinical practice. One is institutional based research, where you are attached to an institution and the institution has its own research program and you can integrate your research activities into that program. Or you can do it in your own clinical practice, in your clinic. This is the basic element of doing research in clinic is to have an electronic medical record system in place. Unless you have EMR, it's not going to be really helpful to do paper CRFs, etc. So, I mean, ma'am may talk about it. So, digitalization of practice is very, very important if you want to pursue research, because anytime you can go back to your database and try to look at the trends, etc., in your clinical practice. At the institutional level, of course, if you are there are other aspects that you need to take care of in the institutional setups, including ethics committee clearances, scientific expert committee of the institutions itself, and these can be challenging and can have a lot of hurdles. So you have to be prepared for tackling these kinds of hurdles if you are trying to do any institutional based practice, institutional based research. The other aspect is very, very critical also, is that you need to have an idea of the regulatory issues in clinical research. A simple thing like a consent of a patient. So we learned it when we started doing our EMR, and we started EMR way back in 2000s. So in 2000, we started recording all our patients' data into an electronic database. And then when we started looking at some of the data and we wanted to publish that data, so the peer reviewers came back and told us that, have you taken consent of your patients to use their data? We said, no, we collected them in routine clinical practice. That is what they are going to do anyway. And we are just looking into it. They say, no, there has to be an informed consent for any patient entering into your clinic, giving you data, you recording it. It may be part of your routine clinical care. But if you want to do research, you need to have a consent for the patient and from the patient, and also have a small proposal and have an ethics committee approval. So you have to be very wary of the regulatory issues. This is very localized clinic based regulatory aspect that I talked about, but then you can always go to ICMR regulatory issues, DCGI regulatory issues if you're conducting clinical trials, etc. So you have to be aware about regulatory issues. And finally, clinical trials, because ma'am will talk about clinical trials, and we have done clinical trials. Clinical trials, see, I think research is not just new drugs. So first of all, I don't believe that research is only new drugs. New drugs develop because basic research happens. But once new drugs develop, you can do clinical trials. Fortunately, and clinical trials are basically either investigator initiated or pharma initiated. So these are two groups of clinical trials. If it's a new investigational drug, it's highly unlikely that you will initiate an investigator based clinical trial for a new drug, because the pharma would be interested in developing the clinical protocol and trying to implement and get the answer out of it. Then how do we do investigator-based clinical trials? Now, those come under the category of what are called as strategy trials. So, for example, we had this START study where we looked at using antiretroviral treatment at different CD4 counts, randomizing patients, starting at at different city for counts. So that doesn't, no pharma was interested in that. So essentially, was an investigator-based clinical trial. And if you have an investigator-based clinical trial, you need to have a team in your clinical practice. You need to have a CRA, you need to have a biostatistician, you need to have lab services which are accredited, and all those kinds of things. If you're doing clinical trials for pharma companies, unfortunately, I don't think it's quite really exciting to do clinical trials for pharma companies. This is my personal opinion. Because there is no creativity in it, honestly. There's no brain that you use. You are kind of a clerk who, implements a program. You are an implementer rather than a creative person. So I would not usually be very excited to do clinical trials for pharma companies, but it is needed. If you have a setup, like what do you have, what we have in our own practice, if we have that setup, we can harness it for that. It of course helps in terms of funding also. So you get a lot of money if you do clinical trials for pharma companies. So I think I'll stop here and then maybe we'll take some questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I would like to start thanking the platform first. Thanks to SYMHEALTH for giving us this opportunity to be here and share our experiences. And thanks to Dr. Pujari for narrating, how a clinician is involved in clinical research and clinical trials. What I'm going to touch base in the next few minutes is how are the other departments within the clinical trial industry associated in the success of a trial? That whether it is investigator-led studies or whether they are, initiated by the pharma companies, there are these other peripheral departments without which a trial cannot be declared successful. So they are equal partners in the success of a trial. And the other sections or the services that I'm talking about is, I'm going to list a few of them and I'm going to give you a small brief of each of them just to get a flavor. Because this is such a topic that you can, talk for hours and hours together, and it's a never-ending thing. But I will try and share as much as possible. So the other departments that definitely support the principal investigator in running the clinical trial, they start right from clinical operations. So there's a team of clinical operations. Then you have medical writing team. You have a clinical data management team. You have regulatory affairs. You have pharmacovigilance team. You have the super powerful quality assurance and quality audit team. So these are various teams that are coming together along with principal investigator, who is the main lead of the trial. Without his approval, without his signatures, nothing moves on. None of the departments can function. So at every step, we definitely need approvals and signatures from the principal investigator, who is the main lead of that particular trial. Now, talking about these other departments, when I talk about clinical operations team, they have various roles. Okay, so you would have heard about CRCs, clinical research coordinators. There are clinical trial assistants. There are CRAs, they are called as clinical research associates. So these are different teams, within the clinops. They come together and support the site to conduct a clinical trial. Now, CRCs would coordinate with the ethics committees. They will be involved in submitting the packages, the dossiers that are required by the ethics committees for approvals. The clinical trial, they would also enter the data, so when the source data is collected at the trial by the principal investigator, it's not the investigator who's doing the data entry. The data entry may be done by a CRC. And then the clinical research associate, or the CRAs, or the clinical monitors as we call, they come and validate whether the source information is actually captured as per the requirement in the electronic data capture systems or in the databases, whatever is being used by the trial. So these are various departments coming together to ensure the site is active. They have sufficient documents, they have sufficient drug, they also support to some extent into the recruitment, but they need to have a knowledge about the therapeutic area that they are covering for. They need to have a knowledge about the protocol. What is the trial all about? They may not understand the end objective, or they may not be able to analyze the data, but at least they should have a basic knowledge to initiate a particular clinical trial site to do the study. So those are the clinical operations team, and then you will have the project managers and the directors and all the other layers above. Talking about clinical ops, once the data is collected at the site, where does it go? That's the question, right? The clinical data management comes into picture. What happens is the data that's collected at the site, the case report forms are designed by the clinical data managers. The protocol and the ICFs, the informed consents, they are designed by the medical writers. Okay, so these are scientific writers who will help the pharma companies or the investigators to design the protocol. And like I said, nothing moves ahead without the signature of a PI. So the protocol has to be signed by the PI, the ICFs have to be signed by the PI, just to check whether we have covered all inclusion exclusion criteria and every norm as per the regulations is followed. Now, clinical data management team, they collect the data from the site. So when I started my career way back 90s, I think 99, 2000, that time we had all paper trials, everything was captured on the paper CRF. We would do the data entry, so I used to actually get scanned copies or sometimes the original copies to do the data entry of the CRF or the cases that we receive from the trials. But today's world is all about electronic versions. So we have electronic data capture systems. There are various databases available in the market. You can, choose whichever are as per. Again, there are regulatory norms even to design an EDC. You cannot just have any database to capture the data. So all the data that's captured from the site, the data manager actually looks into the data. They do the cleaning of the data, which is called as discrepancy management phase, where they will see whether the mandatory data that was supposed to give us the endpoints have been collected. They will also query the site if there are any missing data or any critical data or any queries amongst the modules that has been identified. They would do medical coding of the drugs and the adverse events. They would do SA reconciliation, serious adverse events reconciliation is done. So whatever has been captured in the clinical data, whether it is the same as the safety data, that's a quality control check of the SAs that the data managers does. Once the data is declared clean, and once all the data is completed and gathered and cleaned and database is logged, that's when it enters into a phase of, it is handed over to SAS programmers. They do the running of table listings and graphs. They will collect the data in a specific format so as to be ready for submissions. And also then gets involved the statisticians. Sir already covered the statistical part also, where they do the analysis of the data, again looking at the primary endpoint or the objectives of the trial. So these are again another support teams that are involved. So you have SAS programmers, you have statisticians involved, and once everything is done, the data is then handed over for publications or for regulatory submissions. That's when the regulatory affairs team and the publishing and the submission team come into picture. And at any phase of the clinical trial, quality audits happen for any of the departments. They can go and investigate and they can do the audits at the sites. They can come to the clinical data management team. They can go to the regulatory affairs team, or they want to do the end-to-end audit of the entire trial. So that's another department that comes and plays a very important role and ensures that everything is regulated and as per the regulatory guidance. So these are different, support systems for the clinical trials. And like I said, they are equal partners in the success of the trial. So we spoke about ClinOps, we spoke about clinical data management, medical writers, SAS programmers, statisticians. You have regulatory affairs department coming into picture. You have your submission publishing department coming into picture. So these are, and the way forward for the clinical trials today is EDC, that I said, everything is electronic. We are moving ahead with decentralized trials, right? So that's the new norm. I'm sure everybody is aware of, the decision that we took in 2011 to go ahead and do some decentralized trials. And if I'm not wrong, Pfizer was the first one to do the successful decentralized trials, where we are able to retain, there's a maximum retention of the patients, you are able to retain the patients and the data is coming out very, very fast, because that's the need of the hour. You can't be capturing, like Sir said, everything on the paper and then transcribing it. That's not the norm. Right? And so decentralized trials is the next way forward, and the other upcoming opportunity, I should say, or the options that's coming up is real world evidence or real world data that you guys would have heard about. So that's if not heard about, real world evidence is either you can do retrospective or prospective trials, but that's about the actual electronic health records that are available with majority of the hospitals, with the investigators and with the clinicians who are involved in the research part. So we do a collection of that data. This real world data helps us to design better trials, better quality trials, better efficacy and endpoints that are being evaluated. So we have advanced a lot in the last couple of years, and there's a long way to go. And it's this whole team coming together for the success of a clinical trial. So I'm going to stop here, and we will. I think next step is we'll check with questions. Okay.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, sir, for enlightening us with the topics. It was an honor to have you on stage. Now I will request Dr. Vijay Sagar, Dean of Symbiosis Medical College Women, to felicitate Dr. Sanjay.
We have another 10 minutes of discussion.
Okay. Now the floor is open for panel discussion.
Thank you so much. I hope you all have soaked in all the knowledge and the experience that these two stalwarts have poured through their lectures today. What a wonderful example of how to give a presentation and share your knowledge without using a single slide. Absolutely amazing. Thank you very much, Dr. Pujari and Harshika, for sharing such wonderful insights into clinical research, clinical trials. I want to open the house for discussion because I really want people to contribute to this session by asking questions. If you have any comments that you would like to offer, they're very welcome, and I will then point them over to the two panelists. But before you can start thinking of any questions or comments, Sanjay, you did use that one word, kick. The kick for research, the kick for doing your own analysis. How important is that passion for doing research? And how can you build up on that? How do you nourish that quality that is necessary for research? What did you do so differently that made you different from so many others?
I think passion is needed everywhere.
There are a lot of people sitting here who have a passion for research but don't know how to do it. How did you do it?
Yeah, so the only just having passion may not really help. You need to be, for me it was right time, being in the right time, in the right situation. It is implemented. So once, if you are passionate and if you do a study and if it gets accepted somewhere, and there are 2-3 letters of people coming to approach you, then it's kind of a feedback that justifies that passion. You also get a kick out of it. In addition to the process of working in research, and then more people come in contact with you. You are known widely. If you look at internationally, if you look at lecture conferences, they are hardly addressed by clinicians. They're all researchers, clinician researchers. So, only in India, you have people who address audiences may not be directly involved in research, but that is where the recognition comes. So it is incremental. It has to have a feedback in terms of from people, monetary as well. I'm not saying you don't need money, etc. But monetary as well. So all those things you continue to work towards it. And once you have networks, like I'm part of a Asian network of an observational database for HIV patients. So we contribute 18 countries in Asia. We have database for almost 40,000 patients for the last 20 years.
Wow.
So that is the kind of database you have, which you can look into, and we have had 120 publications over the last 20 years. So of course addressing clinical research questions as well, which are of Asian context, which are of Asian relevance. So I think you just go in, you persevere. I mean, perseverance is very important. You may be rejected multiple times. My papers are rejected multiple times. No paper of mine gets accepted first time. So that doesn't mean I should stop sending that paper. You go to another journal. In fact, one of the tricks that I use is if there are reviewers' comments or why they reject, I try to incorporate that in the resubmission. So it actually
Helps.
process here helps. If a paper is rejected, we improve the quality.
Excellent. Anybody wants to raise your hand? Ask questions? Yes, sir, please. Can somebody give a mic over here? If you can tell us what your name is, where are you from, and whom do you want to address the question to?
Sir, my name is good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Saket. I work with the Maharashtra University Project, Dial-108 project. I head the operations for biomedical department. So my question is to both the witnesses. So I'll split it. First to Ashika ma'am is that, like sir said, papers do get rejected. I'm a clinical educator as well from Stanford School of Medicine program. So we have the papers getting rejected is one of the observations because of the data that we collect is questioned most of the times from where we belong. So the second challenge we have is that even doing an observational study, it becomes a challenge for the data markers that we put in, whether we do it prospectively, and we work close to the government hospitals and institutions. So even if we try and do a prospective study and try to keep the markers, we don't get the feeders as we call it. So how do we work upon it? So how to have an ethical committee which can work with both the parties, like dealing with the government becomes a challenge. So what is the exact role of the ethical committee in our situation, where we work in a public-private partnership? Thank you.
So, my experience has been, in most of the cases, that's a common challenge. We see that because I even if you use the correct markers, it's still a question, right? So, what we have tried doing is right from designing the case report forms, we use the data science. And in today's world, everybody.
If you could hold the mic closer to your,
This is better.
closer, yeah.
So, right, so designing the case report forms as per the standards is the first step. That's what even we have learned over the last several years. Initially, we used to design the CRM and then look at the standards. Now we have gone other way around. Our case report forms are already standardized basis the requirements of the regulatory bodies, and the correct markers are already picked up. So the challenges that we foresee at the end when the data after capturing, after doing the analysis is questioned, obviously it's an eye opener for us as well, saying that okay, you designed it well, but what's happening? What's the end point there? So, like I said, the first step, using standards right from day one. Once the case report forms is designed basis the regulatory standards, we design the electronic data capture also on the same standards. So we have our own global libraries for case report forms and the capture systems, and those are the attempt to avoid those challenges at the end. So that's from the from the support teams, where they can bring in the efficiency that you are looking for.
So if I can just put it into perspective, Sanjay, to add to that, from a clinical trial perspective, there's already an inbuilt system to ensure quality. So the systems are in place for a clinical trial. But Sanjay, for a clinical research, when you do in your clinical practice, what is the importance of integrity and data quality, and how do you maintain that?
So I think I was exactly coming to that issue. First of all, if a paper is rejected multiple times, that means the protocol was wrong. The research question was wrong. And if you have a good research question and there is a problem with some data related issues, you can always adjust those things in the analysis. This is statistical analysis gives you the power to exclude some
data, get your confidence intervals wider, and still able to, because your protocol or your research question is not interesting, or it is repetitive, or it's not adding to furthering of science, our papers may get rejected. So I think protocol is very important, whether it's clinical research or clinical trials. And protocol is actually half work done. We don't write research papers, we write protocols and just translate those in the discussion in the research papers. So protocol is very important. Second is quality control. So for example, as Sundeep mentioned that in clinical trials, and I work with CRO, so I know how quality control is so strict there. But in clinical practice, we also have inbuilt quality control systems. So essentially, if we have, as a clinic, we are NABH accredited. So as an allopathic clinic, our lab, and our clinical services are NABH accredited. So that also brings in certain documentary processes which ensures quality. Apart from that, we have quality checks. In the lab, we do random quality checks. We have internal controls in the lab. We participate in external quality assurance programs in the laboratory services. In the clinical data services, we as clinicians enter, both of us, the required data. Other lab data is extracted from the lab database into a clinical database. We have random checking which happens every 6 months within us. So we have a CRC who does, we randomly select the numbers of MRD patients, and we actually go in to see whether the lab values tie with the lab equipment values, the data ties up with the lab values, etc. So we have that quality control, quality assurance program in place. It's possible in the clinical practices. So outlier values, for example, if we are measuring weight or if a BP measurement is done, and if it's a real outlier, weight of 200 kgs or something, so that is a real outlier. So that those things are also being screened into, and really feedbacks happen between our CRC, who also is a data manager, so data quality manager. So if there is a feedback which happens. If you enter some wrong values, the person calls us back.
Excellent. Excellent. Thank you so much. Any last burning question? I can see one hand, and this is the last question that we will take for this session. Can we have a mic there, please? Yeah, we can hear you. Please go ahead.
Good afternoon, sir. Myself, Dr. Sundeep. I'm working in this committee, Symbiosis and Research Department. So my question is little bit in continuation with what Dr. Saket asked. From the perspectives of a clinical research organization, it is very important to have some points that this should be there, that should be there. But from the perspective of a clinician, suppose a general physician working in a village or a city, what things he should what things he should document so that his data can be effectively utilized for the research. Because many times it may happen that a physician, his data will be very good, but because of he has not documented it well, it may not be used for the research purpose.
Okay. Good, we got the question.
Okay.
20 seconds. Sanjay?
Yeah, so I think whenever we do practice, and especially if we are doing focused practice, there are certain variables which are of interest, which you cover as routine care. So you would always include all those variables. Now, sometimes it may happen that if you want to look at, say, cholesterol value, something related to ART, etc. So in that situation, you can always add those variables. And when you write a paper, you can write that we collected these variables within these time frames. So essentially, that means that we don't have data for the past, but we have this since this time frame, and this is what we saw. So you can always expand your research.
Great, wonderful. So I think on this note, we will come to the conclusion of this wonderful session. Thank you very much, Dr. Sanjay Pujari and Harshika Sachdeva, for your wonderful experience and insights into clinical research and clinical trials. I'm sure all of you all have benefited by what happened in the last 45 minutes. And I hope that some of you all will be inspired and excited to be a part of this wonderful journey of clinical research and clinical trials. Thank you so much.
Now I will request Journal Totatni Sir, Medical Advisor, Symbiosis, and former Vice Chancellor to felicitate Dr. Sanjay Pujari Sir, and Harshita Sachdev, and Sundeep Salvi Sir. Thank you, sir, for welcoming the dignitaries.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I, Nakia Gopalwala, student of MSc Medical Technology.
And I, Atulya Vijayan, student of BSc Medical Technology from Symbiosis Institute of Health Sciences, will take you forward to our next session on technology towards advancement of allied healthcare professionals.
Over the past few years, technology has become a major factor of competition in the entire healthcare industry. The quality of facilities plays an important role in shaping the healthcare programs. Existing and future technologies in healthcare will greatly influence the way healthcare is practiced and delivered. Advanced technology would help in improving health related aspects such as early and precise diagnosis, patient monitoring and safety, as well as reduction of medical errors.
May I now invite Mr. Arun Krishnan, Senior Project Manager, Biomedical Engineering and Technology Innovation Center, IIT Bombay, and Dr. Ambuj Chaturvedi, Senior Vice President, ICICI Knowledge Park, Hyderabad, onto the dais.
Our first speaker, Mr. Arun Krishnan, is the Senior Project Manager at Biomedical Engineering and Technology Innovation Center, also known as BETIC, IIT Bombay. Sir is involved in implementing medical device innovation programs to strengthen, sustain, and scale up innovative project activities. He acts as a liaison between various stakeholders to foster translational research, product innovation, entrepreneurship, and mentoring interdisciplinary teams for medical technology projects. We now request Sir to please address the audience.
Good afternoon, all. Thank you, Symbiosis, for conducting this conference and inviting me to be part of it. Today, on focus area would be technology and innovation empowering allied health professionals. In this session, I'm not going to talk about any technology, futurist technology, which is there. I think multiple people have covered already those topics. So I want to stay to what is, from virtual reality, what is the reality in our country and what could be done to make sure transformation in healthcare can happen in our country. So globally, what is happening is there is technology infusion in healthcare happening, starting from 1.0, 2.0, where somewhere between 3.0 to 4.0, where we started with patient encounter, simple diagnosis and treatment, and moving towards medical equipments, digital imaging, digital tracking, CT, MRA machines which are there. Then from there, we move to electronic records, telehealth, and we are looking at smart health, connected care, personalized medicine, AI, and somewhere we would also reach to virtual care. Being, say, you have a military surgeon and very valuable resource, and you don't want them to go to the field and actually operate directly operate. It's a risky task. So we might get into that stage where the surgeon can even stay at their hospital and take care of the trauma which is happening to the soldiers or who are fighting for us. So all of that, if you look at the technology transformation, it's all focused on patient-centric healthcare services. Now, patient-centric healthcare services need people, infrastructure, technology, all in place to make sure that patient is the right kind of treatment is given to the patient. If you look at our country's current healthcare professionals, just the people which we are falling shortage of healthcare professionals. They're distributed uneven geographically. Very few infrastructure for training and also for allied health professionals as well as health professionals. You can see the rehabilitation related healthcare forces are shortage by 18 lakhs. If you look at dental assistant technology related people, the shortage by 20 lakhs. Although more the reason that technology is needed, there is no running away from the technology. We have to adapt it. All the healthcare professionals has to adapt and make sure that we would be able to deliver the right kind of service to the patients. Coming from the healthcare, what is happening in medical device industry, we have been bombarded with high cost, good quality products from the Western countries and low cost, lesser quality product from the Eastern countries. We have regulations in place. The situation is not dark, there's a ray of hope. Where are very suitable or very significant local needs which are there in our country, which need to be addressed. And there's a lot of technology push which is happening in multiple areas of 3D printing, AI, machine learning, augmented reality. We are good with technology. So bringing both these two together is where the Indian medical device industry can grow. The ray of hope is innovation, be it product innovation or process innovation. That is what is required for India to be innovating. India is innovating right now. Now, to look at what are the streams which will flow to creating this process and product innovation, multiple streams, medicine, design, management, allied health professionals, all coming together to make sure that product or process innovation will happen. Although the innovation is required, there is valleys of death. Or allied health professional today or a health professional faces a problem which is unmet clinical need, and there is a solution, a concept in their mind, and to make it a reality, the valleys of death which has to be crossed for a concept to proof of concept to prototype to product to finally reaching the market and actually touching the patient and creating value to the patient is a long journey. So a single person or a healthcare professional or engineer is not going to, very difficult for them to cross the valleys alone. So what we need is a team, bringing together a team where these engineering clinician side and engineers can together make sure that the values are close.